Thanks, Nanny. And thanks everyone for coming. Now, I'll just warn you before I start that I have a baby sitting on top of my lungs, and it makes me really puffed when I talk. So if every few minutes I stop to breathe, then that's why. Okay, and hello everyone who's tuning in on Facebook Live. Thanks, Joe, for organising that. Okay, so as Nanny said, I was in the Philippines doing anti-trafficking research, and when I was there I met 4 girls who had been sold into a brothel by their own parents. Now, Samar Island is one of the poorest provinces in the Philippines, and due to the extreme poverty that people live in and the lack of job opportunities that they have and the lack of access to maternity, healthcare and family planning and that sort of thing, they often have 7 or 8 kids to look after which they can't send to school. So they're in sort of a desperate situation, and on top of that there is a port nearby which makes it easy to transport people in and out. And so if a recruiter comes and offers them an opportunity to make money, then people often are quite quick to take it. Also, with the low levels of education, it makes them a little bit naive and easy to deceive by unscrupulous recruiters. So basically, I was interviewing these 4 girls who were 13 and 14 at the time their parents thought it was a good idea to sell their virginities in a brothel in a nearby town for 100,000 pesos each, which was over $2,000. So it's quite a lot of money for people living in poverty. Now, the interview took place in Carlotta's house, who was one of the 4 girls, and her parents were present during the interview and were listening to everything that we said. And at the beginning, we were just discussing sort of how it happened, and it came out that her father was a village official. And my interpreter, who was also a social worker, she, at this point, when she found out that the father was official, she was like, "How could you sell your daughter to a brothel? You're a village official, you have a responsibility to protect children in the village." And he was like, "Oh, it wasn't me, it was her mother." And then the mother was there looking after another baby and just sort of was like, "Oh, it wasn't me," and sort of had an awkward look. And so everyone was just sort of like, well, yeah, this happened, but it wasn't considered such a big problem. Now, this household was poor. It was a house made of, well, sort of sticks and straw in a way, but they weren't the poorest of the poor. They had enough food to eat, and all of the houses in the village were the same standard, and the father being official meant they had slightly more money than other people. But their motivation for selling their daughter's virginity was that they wanted to buy a TV set. And the reason being is that with these poor villages, the people are sort of competing with each other, I guess keeping up with the Joneses in a way. And if you have a TV, it increases your status dramatically because all the kids in the village come to your house to watch TV, and then they can, and then the reputation improves and that sort of thing. So basically, they decided that getting $2,000 or 100,000 pesos was an opportunity that was too much to resist, and so they thought it was a fair trade-off. So Carlotta was telling me about the night before she was to go to the brothel, how she was crying and pleading with her parents not to be forced to go, but the parents said, "It's your duty to provide for the family." And this was a theme that came up a lot in the Philippines, that the daughter had a responsibility to sacrifice her own life or her own wishes in order to support the family. So it didn't matter that it was something like forced sex work, as long as it increased the status of the family overall. So she was forced to go, and the family told a few other parents who chipped in their daughters as well, so 4 daughters were sent together. However, luckily for the daughters, they were actually intercepted on the way by the police because a neighbour had heard about the plot and had tipped off the police, who who saved them eventually. And so they narrowly escaped. But they didn't escape stigma. So even though they never actually sold their virginities, because word spread so quickly in the village, once they came back the very next day, everyone in the village knew. And Carlotta said that when she went to school, her teacher announced to the class, "Hey everyone, Carlotta's back. Did you hear she went to the brothel to sell her virginity for 100,000 pesos? Ha!" And so poor old Carlotta quit school and decided to stay at home and sort of never show her face again. And there were no charges pressed against the parents because, well, the father was a village official, so the police, he had a chat to the police and they dropped everything, so that was fine. But also, because this sort of situation is so prevalent in the Philippines, it wasn't seen as such a huge misdemeanor anyway. It wasn't so unusual or unthinkable that parents could sell their daughter like that, even just for a TV. Like, family ties are very strong, and girls have an obligation to sort of sacrifice themselves for the family or to give up their lives for their families. So you can sort of treat them in a way however you want. And so this sort of realization for me was something that made me understand that I had no idea about this context, and poverty was so complex, and trafficking is something which I don't really understand at all. So as much sort of research as you do, or even living in the Philippines and working with people, it's a mindset which I found very difficult to comprehend, because obviously no one we know would think of selling their daughter for a TV, you know, so it's just sort of so far removed from where we are. And then, so with the organisation that I was working with, they provided rehabilitation care for these girls, so they had the opportunity to get education or vocational training, some sort of skills development, so they had a chance to build their lives and work their way out of poverty. But another surprise was that only one of them took up the opportunity, and the rest didn't want to do what they perceived to be hard work. Because also within this poor village culture where there are no jobs and a huge surplus of workers who don't work and children who don't go to school, studying and working wasn't really part of their daily lives. And so they were like, well, we've just had this ordeal, even though they weren't actually exploited. And we've got all of this stigma, so why do we then have to study? Or why do I have to work? No one else is working. So two of the girls, Carlotta and Mary Claire, it was their dream to get married and have children. So in that way the cycle would continue. And one girl decided to take up the opportunity for education, and then the fourth one, Marielle, she decided to migrate to Manila to be a domestic worker. And that's another key thing in the Philippines. It's this culture of migration, where migration is seen as the panacea to all of the problems of poverty. And if you can migrate from a small village to Manila and get a job as a domestic worker, then you become a rich person, and then you come back and they're sort of thought of as heroes because they send money back to their families, and then their families can buy these amazing TVs. And skin whitening treatment is a common reason to migrate, or a flashing handbag, something like that. So these sort of status symbols which improve their lives, I guess, through the eyes of comparison to other people in the village. But the point there is that because migration is seen as the answer to all of their problems, everyone's willing to move already. So when a recruiter comes and says, I've got a job for you in Manila, they take it like that. So they're very easy to deceive. So anyway, Marielle went to Manila to become a domestic worker, but was abused by her employers, as so often happens. So ended up a few months back in the village, doubly stigmatized, this time for being a failed migrant. So if you fail in your migration journey, then you get an extra reputation in a negative way because you're a failure. And so migration can either make or break you, and people think that it's going to make them, but it often breaks them. So on top of that, there's a lot of corruption, and like as Carlotta's father was the village official, and he was selling his own daughter. In the same way, police are involved in the sex trade, and the brothel owners pay them to keep quiet, and judges were paid off, and lawyers were paid off, even social workers were paid. We heard of a social worker who had a trafficked girl in custody who she had to take back to her village, but she couldn't be bothered taking them to the village, and the trafficker gave her a few pesos, and so she let him go. She let the girl go off to Manila. And then there was another case where the police had actually caught a trafficker, had him in custody, but had no fuel in the police car to take him to court, so they let him go as well. So, I mean, we heard so many stories like this that it was just sort of like, well, I mean, the problem is overwhelming here. The people that are supposed to protect vulnerable populations are not, because they're poor themselves, so they're taking bribes, and there's corruption everywhere, and there's so much poverty that it just sort of seemed like quite a big mess. And so I sort of reflected on my role as a foreigner, perceived rich woman from New Zealand, which was another place where a lot of people wanted to migrate. Once you made it to Manila, you wanted to either go to Singapore as a domestic worker, to Saudi Arabia as a construction worker, or to New Zealand as, well, as anything. You know, everyone wants to come to New Zealand. But everyone I spoke to, no matter what their status in society, wanted to migrate. And so the point was, my role as an outsider, not understanding the local language, not really understanding this sort of mindset where you can make the decision to sell your daughter for a TV. I had to sort of reassess my role and thought, how can I actually help, or what is my place here? And that is where I'll take a break to breathe.
Breathing is good.
Breathing is good. Push the baby down. So without having any answers, apart from the fact that I saw some extremely dedicated local people working really hard to do what they can do, and to help the people. So there were people on the anti-trafficking team who were making strides, and they were doing awareness raising campaigns and this sort of thing. So they were lobbying for the government to have tighter laws against traffickers and this sort of thing. So progress was being made. So that was something positive. But for me, it was probably not a lot that I could do. And then I moved to Singapore, and when I was there, I found out what happened to the lucky ones who managed to migrate to Singapore. And the first girl that I interviewed when I was working with an organisation there called Home was a girl from a poor village in Myanmar called Nu. And her family were a family of farmers who didn't own any land, so they made enough money just to sell a few vegetables to feed themselves each day. But she was pulled out of school at the end of primary school to work, and her brothers couldn't afford to go to school and that sort of thing. She couldn't speak any English, she'd never left her village, but her brother's friend's friend had met someone in the capital, Yangon, who told him about this amazing job in Singapore where you can earn $450 a month just for cooking and cleaning. And she was like, wow, I cook and clean every day anyway, you know, and I don't earn any money. And her parents earned about $40 a month each. So $450 just for her was like a dream come true. So she went to Yangon and she spoke to the agent, and they said, yeah, it's really easy money. She was very scared because, you know, she was from the village, country people, uneducated, couldn't speak English, and had to speak English in Singapore, but she was like, well, it's an opportunity that's too good not to take up. So then they explained to her their fees, and the fees were 7 months of her salary. So she would work for 7 months for free, and then she would get paid from the 8th month. So it was a 2-year contract, so she agreed to do that. And actually that's standard practice in Singapore. All domestic workers pay 7 months' salary for their agent fees. But not all of them know about that when they come. So their families are expecting the remittances after maybe 1 or 2 months, but they have to wait until the 8th month before they actually get paid. And the workers, it was 7 days a week, but this organisation lobbied for 10 years to convince the Singapore government that domestic workers need 1 day off a week. So now they get Sundays off, but often the employers will pay them a bit extra to work the Sundays as well. And actually domestic work is not included under the labour law because it's not considered real work. So she didn't know all of this, but she did know that she wouldn't be paid for a while. And that was fine. But when she arrived in Singapore, her employers were a Singaporean couple, Singaporean Chinese, with 3 kids. And the kids were aged 1, 3 and 7, and they didn't really like her. And this was a problem from the beginning. So her working hours, she was promised that she would get every Sunday off, but she got no days off. And she worked for them for 10 months, so 10 months straight, without a day off. And her working hours were 5:30 in the morning until 2 or 3 a.m. the next morning. And if she had cleaned all of the house, she was told to keep cleaning. So she just had to keep working. And then when she was tired, she was punished. So every morning the father would make her run up and down the hallway 100 times to punish her for being tired and for not speaking English. And if she left the floor a little bit wet or made mistakes like that, then they would dock her pay. So in the end she worked for 10 months, but she didn't receive any pay. And for her food, she was given rice 3 times a day, just plain rice, but only a small amount. And often it was mixed with sugar to make her vomit. And she was made to eat on all 4s like a dog, with her mouth straight from a plastic bowl. And they were saying, you are a dog, so you eat like a dog. And then they would mix her rice with sugar so she would vomit, and then force her to eat the vomit. She was allowed to drink water 3 times a day and go to the toilet 3 times a day. But if she went more than 3 times a day, she would be punished because it was a waste of water to flush the toilet. And they had cameras everywhere. She was under constant surveillance, so if she broke the rules, they knew. And she was beaten. Her hair was hacked off with scissors, and she was beaten with many different instruments, and made to jump around like a rabbit on 1 foot. Basically humiliated, psychologically, emotionally, physically tortured. She was made to sometimes clean in her underwear, this sort of thing. So you name it, it happened to her. They also threatened her family back in Myanmar, and they said, if you run away, we can find and kill your family. We are rich, you are nothing, we control you. And so they also confiscated her passport and her mobile phone, so she had no way of escaping anyway. So she stayed like this for 10 months, until one day the mother took her to the airport and said, I'm sending you back to Myanmar now. And so threw away all of her clothes and all of her belongings, and took her to the airport and deported her back to Yangon. When she was in Yangon, she was a bit shaken up. She was black and blue, and a kind lady helped her find her agent. And she explained the situation that happened to her to the agent, and the agent was like, this is horrific, and cried with her and was like, this is not what we expected, you know, I'm so sorry. And he paid for a ticket for her to go back to Singapore to testify against her employers to put them in jail. So she went back and she told the Ministry of Manpower, the Labour Department, about the abuse, and they referred her to Home, the shelter, the organisation which runs the shelter, which is where I met her. and she stayed there for 2 years, basically in limbo, while they investigated the case. Now they've got 19 charges against the female employer and 23 charges against the male employer, and the case is ongoing, so she's still testifying. This is a good chance for me to breathe.
Yes. Should I? It won't. Good. It was all planned. We planned this to give you a break.
That's okay. She's using that for the thing.
It's all right.
So, once she was in the shelter, she was able to receive all the care that she needed. So the organisation, they gave her trauma counselling, they gave her plenty of food and water, and they provided her with educational courses, so she learnt very good English, and she learned some business skills, so when she goes back to Myanmar she's going to open a vegetable shop with her parents, and she was also given a pro bono lawyer to help her prosecute her employers. And I was with her the first time she went to court, and I had heard all these stories about the employers, and then they walked past us and she was like, "That's them." And I was so furious, I was almost going to like get up and strangle them or something, you know. And actually they just looked like normal people. They were about 38, this couple, well, she had like a bit of a snarl on her face, this woman, but she was very sort of fashionable, and she was waltzing in like it was an injustice that she was forced to go to court and defend herself, you know. And poor old Nu was sort of trembling beside me, and but at the same time she had what some of my colleagues who work at the organisation call the fibre, and it's this sort of strength, inner strength and determination to overcome everything that's happened. And she said, "I'm going to get them," you know. And so she, because she was considered a trafficking case, she was able to change employers and work for someone else. Now she was so traumatised that she didn't want to do domestic work, but she wasn't allowed to work in another industry. So she was like, "Well, I'll give it a go." So she's working again with another employer who treat her much better, obviously. Not perfect, because domestic workers are never treated very well. There's sort of an understanding that they're lower citizens, and that they can be treated like servants, you know. So she's not treated perfectly, but much better. And she's earning her $450 a month, so she's sending money back to her family, who are so proud of her, and she's planning on opening this shop when she goes back, after she prosecutes the people and puts them in jail, which there's a very good chance that she will. She'll go back. But unfortunately, not so many abused domestic workers are as lucky, this is probably the wrong word, but as her to be considered victims of trafficking. The way the system works is that because of this, the way the agency fees are, where you have to pay 7 months' salary, that is considered practices similar to slavery under international law, and which Singapore adheres to officially. So that would mean that about 2 million workers in Singapore, who make up the domestic workers and the construction workers, would all be considered victims of trafficking. So they're very reluctant to admit that they have an issue here, because the economy relies on exploiting these poor migrants from surrounding Asian countries. So we would file these cases of trafficking which, you know, ticked all the boxes of this is a clear trafficking case, and then we'd send it to the task force, and then they would say this is a no, but with no explanation. And sometimes we'd send 2 identical cases, one would be a yes, one would be a no, but there would be no explanation. So it's all very arbitrary. And so they've got a huge trafficking issue in Singapore, which is kept swept under the rug so that they can continue these exploitative practices. So anyway, Nu was fortunate to be considered trafficking, but it was such an extreme case that they would have been a bit crazy not to. And that gave me a lot of hope, seeing how she had the fibre, and once she had the conditions set for her, where she was able to receive shelter and legal support and counselling and education and the opportunities and safe employment, the opportunities she needed to rebuild her life, she took the bull by the horns, and she was determined to do that. And so this gave me a lot of hope to see that even though there's so much destruction and sort of really intense, awful situations that these poor people face really on a daily basis around Asia, but also in a rich country like Singapore, but there are amazing organisations who actually do provide the stepping stones that they need in order to rebuild their lives. So that was a bit more positive after the sort of Philippines experience. So I'll just take a breather. Usually I can talk for ages without having to breathe. It's just the baby. So more recently I met a girl in Batam called Anita. Now Batam is an island which is 40 minutes ferry ride from Singapore, and it's another trafficking hotspot because there are something like 4,000 factories there. So people migrate from all over Indonesia to go to Batam, and also because of its location so close to Singapore, people then try and get into Singapore. So there's a lot of... it's just the baby.
Sorry.
That's all right. So more recently I met a girl... That sounds like my voice.
Yeah, that's you, but I don't know what you're doing there. Oh, there you go. Now you're gone. Sorry, Christy.
No.
Another Christy was trying to intrude into our talk, but we kick her out.
All Christies want the limelight. So anyway, yeah, Batam is a bit of a sin city in a way. There's a lot of internal migrants from Indonesia. They're very poor. They're looking for work. They're vulnerable because they're isolated in a new place. They're far from their families. There's a lot of drug use and drug trafficking and sex work and that sort of thing. And a lot of the women who go there looking for work, if they don't find work in the factories, then they're vulnerable for the reasons as I just explained, and so they're often deceived or forced into sex work and this sort of thing. And so Anita was residing in a shelter there, and she came from Sumatra, in a rural village in Sumatra, and her family was, I guess in a similar situation to Minu from Myanmar. They were peasants, farmers who didn't so very poor, looking for opportunities, and it was her responsibility to try and make it to Singapore to get the dream job of being a domestic worker. So again, she was very scared to leave her village. Her English wasn't great, but it was her duty, and she managed to find an agent who said that she could get her into Singapore, and so she was very proud. And when she arrived in Singapore, she was not abused, so that was nice. And she was working hard. She did her 7 months, and then on the 8th month she was getting paid, and so she was sending money back to the family, and she was a little bit of a hero in the village, so she was one of the success stories. And on top of that, she fell in love, and she met an Indonesian migrant worker who was working construction there, and because she had her every Sunday off, and so the migrant workers often meet in the parks in Singapore. The domestic workers hook up with the construction workers, and they have a little party. So that was fine. She had the love of her life and the dream job. And then she got pregnant, And as soon as she got pregnant, Singapore deported her because it's illegal for domestic workers to be pregnant. So their employment pass is immediately cancelled as soon as they get pregnant. So she was deported, and her partner, her boyfriend, abandoned her because he was looking after his family back in Indonesia, and he was in no position to support her and her child, so he disappeared. And she wasn't allowed to go back to her village because she was from a conservative Muslim village, and an unmarried pregnant person was a huge stigma. It was a disgrace to the family, and so her family would not accept her home. So Home, the shelter that looked after Nu, sent her to a shelter that they had set up in Batam for women such as Anita. So she was referred there. So all at once she lost her dream job, and she lost her boyfriend, she lost her family, she lost her dignity, her reputation, everything. And unplanned pregnancies are very common in Batam because of the nature of this sort of transitional environment that people live in, where they have these sort of relationships without marriage and without protection and without money. So people get pregnant and then they don't know, they can't look after the babies. So babies are often abandoned or aborted or adopted through dubious methods. And there's a lucrative baby trafficking trade from Batam to serve clients in Malaysia and Singapore. When I say clients, I mean rich parents who want to adopt babies. So they're sort of trafficked out. In worst cases, they are taken to brothels and that sort of thing. But also the people that we work with there said that they've found several babies in dumpsters and toilets where people have had them and just abandoned them. So Anita didn't want to adopt out or abandon or abort her baby, and so she stayed in the shelter, and where she is being looked after, and she received all the medical care she needed, so she had a safe birth. They're looking after her and her baby. Her baby is JJ. I probably shouldn't have said the name. Sorry, Anita, if you're watching. And but he's 5 months old and he's absolutely gorgeous. And I held him and he's super smiley and a wonderful guy. And Anita is very happy. So she had a very traumatic time. But she's used this time to reflect a lot on her life and how she was sort of at the top and then went back to the bottom, and she was like, how did this happen? And she understands that society has treated her unfairly, and she shouldn't face such discrimination for being an unwed mother. She shouldn't have been ousted from her village and her family just for this. And she understands that a lot of people are in the same position, a lot of women are in the same position, and so, but are not as lucky as her to be so looked after in a shelter. They're also giving her education opportunities. She's becoming a nail stylist so that later she can work in a nail salon and provide an income for her baby. And she is well, safe and clothed and well fed and all of that, and she understands that in Batam most women are not, and they're in a lot of much more precarious situations than she is. So she's using her relatively privileged position in the shelter to raise her voice and sort of create a network of solidarity among single mothers who are highly discriminated against and stigmatized in a conservative Muslim country like Indonesia. So she wrote a blog which she asked us to post, which we did because she wants to spread the word out, and she wants to connect with other women in her situation to tell them, like, we're okay, you know, we shouldn't be rejected from society, you know, maybe we made a mistake or maybe we didn't or whatever, but we're human beings. And so she wants to sort of create a support network where other people don't have to feel the shame that has been inflicted on her. She sort of rejected the shame and said, this is not right, and other people shouldn't have to feel it. So she's using her time to help other people. And so she's really inspiring because she's another one who has the fibre, and she's able to do that because she's involved in an organisation which provides those stepping stones where people who end up sort of at the bottom of the pile are able to rebuild their own lives, and then once they do that, they then seek to help others. And the lady who runs the shelter, Rahayu, she's another woman who's a very inspiring woman. Now I'll just quickly take a breath. She's another Indonesian woman who came from, I think it was Sumatra, but I'm not sure. But anyway, she came from another province in Indonesia. And she was visiting Singapore a few years ago. And she had always sort of had a feeling that she wanted to do something to help people, but she was a single woman and from a village and didn't have a lot of confidence, quite shy. But she went to Singapore to visit friends, and then she happened to meet the founder of Home, the organisation in Singapore which looked after Nu. And the founder of Home said, we're setting up a shelter in Batam and would like you to run it. And she was like, oh no, not Batam. I'm not going to Batam. It's a scary place. It's full of criminals. It's very dangerous. Everyone lives in slums and it's chaotic. No. And so Bridget Tan, the founder of Home, was like, well, okay, up to you. And then the next day she was walking down the street and she was next to a high-rise building and she saw an Indonesian domestic worker jump from the window to her death and splattered on the concrete in front of her. And she understood the story, and this woman was being abused, and she was like, this is what's happening to my people in Singapore. This cannot happen. And so from that moment she was like, I've seen this. I can't turn my back on it, you know. I know the abuse that's happening. I know these people need help. I can't sit there and not do something to help. And so she was like, even though I'm so scared, I'll move to Batam and I'll manage this shelter. So she told Bridget Tan that she would do that, and so now she works in Batam, and she does such incredible work. She also runs 5 primary schools that they've set up in slums in Batam, and the schools were doing so well that 30 more parents enrolled their children in. And so she accepted them in, but they didn't have a teacher because they didn't have the budget for it. So she hired a new teacher but cut her own salary to pay for the teacher. This is how much she really cares about the people that she works with. Like, she really dedicates her life to it. She says she's called by God to do it, and she's so passionate and so caring. It's really inspiring just talking to this woman, you know. And when I met her, she had just, she was a partner of Just People's, and we were selling the Christmas cards last year, and one of them was to pay for a month's salary for a teacher for one of their schools. And anyway, we sold enough to cover the salary, but I hadn't told her this when I went to Batam to meet her. And so she was telling me how she hired this new teacher. She was very proud because the school was doing so well, and the kids in her school were getting to the top once they entered the public primary schools. These are kindergarten, so once they entered the public primary schools, they were getting top marks, better than the kids that had gone to private schools. So they were having amazing results because everyone who works with these kids is so passionate and so committed to their learning, so that they can build better lives, because it's such a sort of desperate situation that they understand, those who do understand the value of education work so hard to make it worthwhile for these kids so that they can have a better life than their parents and this sort of thing. And so anyway, 30 extra kids came, so she hired this teacher even though she didn't have enough money for it. And then I said to her, how much money is it? She said it was $900 for the salary. And I said, well, actually, we sold enough Christmas cards and I have $904 for you. And she just sort of cried and she was like, it's a miracle. I asked God to provide and he provided and here you are, you know. And she was just so happy and I was like, well, this is the most amazing thing to be able to give this lady exactly what she needs. And so this sort of, well, obviously it makes it worthwhile, but I guess the point here is that there are people like Rahayu in every location that we go to, you know. So as much as I saw in the Philippines that the problems were so big and I didn't know where to help and I didn't know what I could do, like through all of these experiences I sort of reassessed my role in poverty reduction and how I can best support these people. As someone who doesn't speak the local languages, you know, Bahasa in Indonesia, and sometimes you need Chinese in Singapore and Tagalog in the Philippines. I don't speak the local languages, I don't understand the local context, and people from within those communities are always going to be better placed to support the people who they work with. And so it's really, I guess, encouraging that you find people like Rahayu in every location who know exactly what to do, who understand the needs of their people and are working towards fixing it. And usually all they need is a little bit of money to run their amazing projects. And so what I can do is to share their stories and to amplify their voice and get their message out there. And that's it.